answers?
You have offended my family.
I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth!
And you have offended a Shaolin temple.
You can't handle the truth!
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Radical Rant.
All right, folks, an extended rant for today because I've been doing a lot of research on this topic since Jennifer Alexander brought it up on the show, a week or two ago. And it's the topic of felon disenfranchisement. She's the campaign manager for the Oregon Cannabis Tax Act, which is currently gathering signatures. And of course, when you gather signatures, you have to ask if the person signing is a registered voter. And so many times the response we get back is, oh, no, I can't vote. I'm a felon, right? I was convicted of a drug felony. Well, the fact is that so many of you that think that you cannot vote, you actually can. I want to take a look at some of this data here that I've put together, and this will be all presented as well in my big book of marijuana facts that I'm putting together. And this is a slide that I've showed you before of the arrests in the war on drugs. Now, over in the top right corner there, the chart that's got the gray and got the green on it, that's the chart of arrests in America, drug arrests. Now, the green section of that is the section representing marijuana arrests, 20.8 million marijuana arrests since 1970. And then the gray section is all the arrests for things that aren't marijuana, crack and meth and ecstasy and LSD, whatever, right? Now, as we look at that, we have 858,000 people arrested every year on marijuana offenses, and then a total of about 1.6 million people arrested on all drug offenses combined. And as the pie charts show you, when it comes to other drugs, the possession, 75% of those arrests are for possession alone. And when it comes to marijuana, 88% of those arrests are for possession alone. And what this turns out to be is that we have 46% of all arrests in America for any drug whatsoever. 46% of those arrests are for marijuana. 6% are for marijuana manufacturing. So all marijuana arrests combined make up 52% of the arrests in the war on drugs. Now, this has the effect of putting more people behind bars in the United States than in any other country in the world. 2.3 million prisoners, if you include people in jail, county jail, state jail, and so on. 2.3 million people behind bars in the United States, 23% of the world's imprisoned. We are outdoing China, not just per capita, but overall. The entire nation of China only has 1.6 million prisoners. And of course, this has an effect that is very much like the Jim Crow laws of the past, with those 1.5 million U.S. federal and state prisoners, and that's just the prison population, not the jails. 67% of the U.S. population is white. 70% of the people that use marijuana every month are white. 71% of the people who use all illegal drugs are white. But when you look at the makeup of prison, 45% of drug prisoners are black, 19% are Hispanic. Another way to think of it, 2 out of 3 people in America are white, but 2 out of 3 people doing time for drugs are not. And that has led, of course, to our prison population, this blue area, dating back all the way to 1935, we had about 250,000 people in prison. But once we hit 1970 in the war on drugs, you can see how that imprisonment rate just skyrockets to the point now where we have 1.6 million people behind bars. And of those 1.6 million, 23% of them are there on some sort of drug charge. Now, this is why I wanted to talk about felon disenfranchisement, because once these people are busted, so many of these charges involving drugs end up being some sort of felony charge. And we're going to take a look at another map here, a map of the United States. Let me flip back to this one here, which will give you an idea of what I'm talking about for felon disenfranchisement. It's costing us so many votes when we were looking at changing these laws. There's a great song by Carolyn Wonderland where she talks about, I can't even vote to change the laws that put me down. And that's exactly what I'm talking about here. People that are busted in the drug war thinking they've lost their right to vote, or in many cases actually losing their right to vote, who then cannot do anything about the laws that put them down. On this chart, what I've done is I've color-coded the United States based on its felon disenfranchisement rules. Only the black-colored states on this map are felons permanently barred from voting. Only the black-colored states. So we're talking about Washington State, Wyoming, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and Florida. And then there's a few states there that are kind of shaded both black and red. In those states, Nevada, Arizona, and Nebraska, first-time felons don't lose their right to vote. But the second time you commit a felony, you lose your right to vote. So all of those black-colored states are a place where you are permanently losing your right to vote. And in some cases, you can apply to get your right to vote back. In Florida, for example, there's a 5 to 7 year waiting period after you've finished your parole, your probation, paid all your fines, gotten out of jail. You have to wait 5 to 7 years, depending on the drug felony, to apply to the clemency board to get your right to vote back. In Alabama, you can apply to get your right to vote back. In Tennessee, drug felons can apply to get their right to vote back. In Virginia, there's a 5-year waiting period, but you can still apply to get your voting rights back. In Kentucky, you have to apply for a pardon from the governor in order to get your voting rights back. In Nebraska, there's a 2-year waiting period. In Wyoming, first-time nonviolent felons can wait 5 years to apply for their voting rights back. Second-timers have to apply directly to the governor. Nevada and Arizona, same situations. First-time felons can get their vote back immediately upon completing their sentence, but second-timers have to apply for their voting rights. And in Washington, it's still questionable because the Ninth Circuit Court has ruled it unconstitutional to take away their voting rights. That's on appeal to the United States Supreme Court. So at the current moment in Washington state, if you're a convicted felon, you cannot vote. But all the rest of the states in the United States have color-coded red, orange, yellow, and green. Now, let's start from the green states. The green states are states that have absolutely no restriction on a felon voting. You can actually vote from prison in these states. While you're serving your felony time, you can vote absentee. And these are only 3 states. In Maine and Vermont, you are allowed to vote at any time, even while you're serving prison time. Now, an interesting state is Mississippi. Mississippi, you've noticed I've colored black to green, because in Mississippi there are 21 specific felonies where you lose your right to vote. But drug felonies are not counted amongst those 21 specific felonies. So actually in Mississippi, if you're serving felony time for a drug charge, you can vote from prison, just like you can in Maine and Vermont. Now, as we look at the rest of the states, the levels of yellow, orange, and red, are indicating people that cannot vote while they're serving time for their felony, but once they get out, they can vote. And it depends on the level here. In the yellow states, you can only not vote if you're currently in prison. But if you're on parole or probation, you can vote. So those are the best of all these felon disenfranchisement states. And that's going to include the state of Oregon, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, and most of the Great Lakes states, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. In all those yellow states and the District of Columbia, you can vote after you have gotten out of prison, even if you're still on parole or probation. Now, the orange states are places where you cannot vote if you're incarcerated or on parole, but if you're on probation, you can still vote. So that would count Connecticut, New York, South Dakota, Colorado, and California. And then the red states, which make up most of the states, about 18 of them, these red states are the ones where you cannot vote if you're incarcerated, on parole, or probation. But once you've finished your sentence, once you've finished your parole, your probation, paid your fines, gotten out of prison, you can vote. And that's Alaska, Idaho, New Mexico, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Wisconsin, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, West Virginia, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware. Now, there's also one other way that our voting rights are taken away from us. In 10 states, they actually take away your voting rights if you're incarcerated for a misdemeanor, any misdemeanor. And those are the states with the blue outlines, which include Idaho, South Dakota, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, or South Carolina. So basically, in those blue states, those states with the blue outlines, I should say, if you're in jail for whatever, felony or misdemeanor, you can't vote. So my home state of Idaho, one of the worst states that's not a black state, if you're in jail for anything, even a minor misdemeanor, you can't vote. In all the other states, you can vote absentee. And then in Iowa and West Virginia that are colored teal there with the teal outlines, those have certain misdemeanors for which you cannot vote. Drug misdemeanors are included in there as well. Now, what this means, by all of this felon disenfranchisement, this means that 2.4% of the overall voting population in the United States of America cannot vote. And we are arresting 1.6 million people a year. And keep in mind that those numbers add up year after year. So these people that think they can't vote because they're felons, or in the cases of Florida, Alabama, all those black states actually can't vote because they're felons, this is causing us to lose support for our marijuana reform initiatives. So many of these people would be signing these petitions. They would be working with us to try to pass these laws to help end marijuana prohibition, but because they either can't vote because of their law, or they think they can't vote because a parole officer, probation officer, or just general wisdom has told them that they can't vote because they're a felon, we are losing so many votes and so many signatures because of this. And that's why I wanted to make this a focus of today's show. Because there are so many places where we could be gathering signatures from, say, prisons. We could be gathering votes and registering voters in prisons, people that would support reforming these drug laws. So many people behind bars for nonviolent drug offenses could be extra signatures on our pages. So I wanted everybody to know about this. Now, the other thing about this disenfranchisement, is how it affects African American voting totals. 8.3% of all African Americans are disenfranchised at this point. 8.3% are disenfranchised. 1 out of 12 we're talking about here that cannot vote because of these disenfranchisement laws. And we know how racially disproportionate the arrests and conviction rates for African Americans are compared to white Americans in this country for drug crimes. We see that this war on drugs is a systematic way of denying African Americans the right to vote. And in her excellent book about the drug war, the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander shows how more black people are disenfranchised because of the drug war now than were disenfranchised because of Jim Crow laws during Reconstruction. This is just Jim Crow by another name, folks. It's felon disenfranchisement. And worst of all, of course, Florida. We mentioned in Florida that you got the 5 to 7 year waiting period before you can even apply to the clemency board after you've finished all your parole, probation, and so on, right? So imagine that you're sentenced to, let's say, 10 years in Florida, so you're not voting for 2 presidential elections, and then you got to wait another 5 years or 7 years after you get out. So now there's another 3 or 4 presidential elections you haven't been able to vote in, and then you've got to apply to the governor. You got to apply, this clemency board. You got to apply to this clemency board just to get your vote back. Who knows how long that takes? And this adds up and adds up and adds up to the point where now, in the state of Florida, 9% of all their citizens, 9%, and a stunning 18.8% of all African Americans cannot vote in the state of Florida. This is so contrary to our democracy, so contrary to what we would understand as being an American value. We have got to change some of these laws. We've got to take a look at defelonizing so many of these drug crimes. I'm peppered by questions from activists all over the country, and I'm here in Oregon, where of course we have medical marijuana, we have decriminalization, but sometimes people saying, well, Russ, there's no way we're going to get medical. There's no way they're going to decrim here in our state, in whatever state you might be in. Well, how about defelonizing some of these crimes? How about raising the limits before a certain possession crime becomes a felony? If we can make less felons, that's certainly a road to more reform in this country. So if you're in some conservative Midwestern state or Southern state and you don't think there's a way you can do reform, think about defelonizing some of these crimes. And you can attack this by showing how much it costs to house an offender. $30,000 a year in some states to house an offender who's convicted of a felony crime, or as low as $13,000 a year in Louisiana. So there's between $15,000 and $30,000 a year. Show that cost. Show the cost of taking them through the courts, through all of the felony appeals, and we can make a dent in this and maybe have more voters available for us when we're trying to change these laws. And the other reason Florida is leading the nation in felon disenfranchisement has to do with those limits that I was just telling you about. What it takes to create a felon in the state of Florida. This is another map that I put together that I call felony marijuana amounts. And it is color-coded to show you how much it takes to automatically be a felon in these particular states. How much is a per se felony in these states? Now, it varies from state to state, and it's a little hard to pin down because some of them have variances, some of them have specific laws on cultivation, some don't. And also, you can get different felonies based on, say, how close you were to a school, or whether or not there was possession with intent to sell. Right? So like your 8 ounces might be possession, but if you have 8 ounces in a scale, now it's a felony. Or if you had a firearm, even if it's a legally owned firearm, that can change your misdemeanor into a felony. So we're not paying attention to all of those what ifs that could make something a felony. This is just, if you look at normal.org and you take a look at the number it takes to make a felony, that's what this map represents. And now let me get into a little more detail and show you what we're talking about here. The black states are the states where an amount of less than an ounce can be a felony. Less than 28 grams can be a felony. Now, there's only 2 states where this is possible. In the state of Florida, the worst state, more than 20 grams is automatically a felony. Now, that's not even an ounce, folks. That's about 3/4 of an ounce is an automatic felony in the state of Florida. There's also, and you can see from this icon that looks like a pot leaf with a slash through it, personal cultivation is a felony. And I put that on there because in some states, they don't actually have a cultivation felony. They just have possession. But the possession of that plant you're cultivating counts against the weight. So yeah, there is a felony for it. They just don't specifically say if you have 3 plants, you have 10 plants, you have any plants. But in every state, just about, cultivation of a plant is a felony. And the other state that's really harsh on this is Arizona. Any amount less than 2 pounds in Arizona can be charged as a misdemeanor or a felony. Guess it depends on the DA and some of the circumstances, but literally a speck of pot could be a felony in Arizona. Probably wouldn't be charged as that, but it could be. It's on the books that way. Then you'll see a whole bunch of these states that have gray shading, and the gray shading indicates that there is no specific amount that makes a felony. For example, in the state of California, all of its possession penalties are misdemeanors of varying levels where you can get more and more prison time depending on how much you have, but they don't have a specific amount that triggers a felony. And that's in a lot of states, actually. Iowa is that way, Michigan, Pennsylvania, a lot of the New England states don't have a specific felony amount. But again, you could be charged for cultivation felony, for sales felony, all sorts of other ways they could get you. Now, as we look at some of these states that are gray and black, like Kansas or Oklahoma, these are states where your first possession is a misdemeanor, but any subsequent possession is a felony. So the second time they catch you in Kansas, felony. Second time they catch you in Oklahoma, felony, right? And there's some of these other states that vary. And let me go back to the guide here. We've once again color-coded the states based on how much you can have before you're automatically a felon. So the darkest red, an ounce makes you a felon. Bright red, 2 ounces makes you a felon. Orange, 4 ounces makes you a felon. Yellow states, 8 ounces makes you a felon. Light green, it takes a pound to make you a felon. Dark green, it takes you over a kilogram to make you a felon. And so as we look at the states, it's quite surprising what you'll find. For example, out here in the West, we already pointed out Arizona, any amount can make you a felon. But in the other 4 corner states, in New Mexico and Colorado, you have to have a half pound on you before you're automatically a felon. And in Utah, you have to have over a pound on you before you're a felon. That's right. Let me underline that and repeat. In Utah, you have to have over a pound before you're a felon. So, we all think of Utah, super hyper conservative, must hate pot, but actually up to a pound, you're still only committing a misdemeanor. Now compare that to the great Pacific Northwest, where I'm living, where everybody thinks, oh, Washington and Oregon, medical marijuana, Oregon's got decrim, everybody's all pot friendly. But notice the dark red color of Washington and Oregon. That means it only takes you an ounce, and in Washington is 40 grams, so an ounce and a half. But it only takes you a little less than 2 ounces to be a felon in the state of Washington or Oregon. A pound in Utah, a little over a couple of ounces in Oregon or Washington.
That's why I never leave the house with more than an ounce.
Yeah, don't leave the house with more than an ounce. And
even as a medical patient, I don't.
Yeah, exactly. And when we're talking about, activism here in Oregon, and everybody complains like, oh, it's all medical, everybody's all medical. What's there to do for, we're already decrim in Oregon. Yeah, well, here's a perfect thing to take on in Oregon, raising that ounce to something reasonable. Yeah. It's amazing to me that if you have 27 grams on you, you're going to get a $100 ticket and no criminal record. If you have 29 grams on you, you're a felon. That just cannot be. That is something we should definitely be working on here in the state of Oregon. Now, looking around some of the other states, of course, Montana, if you have over 2 ounces, over 60 grams, you're a felon. If you have under 60 grams, the second time, you're still a felon. So it takes over 60 grams to be a felon in Montana, but the second offense, it takes any amount, and you're a felon. Idaho and Wyoming, 3 ounces will create a felony for you. And then some other surprises again. Nebraska takes a pound to become a felon. Texas and Alaska take 4 ounces before you become a felon. And in Alaska, there's a new icon there you may not have noticed, this little 25 on the pot plant. You have to be cultivating 25 plants or more in Alaska to be a felon. Under 25 plants is not a felony. Same thing goes for Hawaii. Under 25 plants, not automatically a felony. Kansas, believe it or not, you have to be cultivating 5 plants in Kansas before they automatically consider that a felony. Ohio is another one of these states. Over 200 grams is that what it takes to create a felony. In New York, over half a pound is a felony. And then one other thing, I've made another icon here. Looks like a couple icons actually. Looks like an apple with a slash through it. This shows you where if you possess any amount near a school, and that's usually 1,000 feet within a school, then you're a felon. And that would apply to Arizona, Kansas, Louisiana, Georgia, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Delaware. Any amount near a school, you're a felon. And the problem with that is, in most urban areas, you are within 1,000 feet of a school. No matter where you're at. In most cities, you're within 1,000 feet of these protected areas. So it makes felons out of people who are only having misdemeanor amounts on them if it was considered for personal use, but because they're close to a school, even if they're not outside. I mean, they could be upstairs in their 5th floor apartment, the door's locked, but because they're within 1,000 feet of a school, they'll tack a felony onto that. And one other icon, this looks like a little pot pipe with a slash through it. These are the states where sales of paraphernalia is a felony. If you sell a pot pipe, you're committing a felony. And that counts for Nevada, Idaho, Missouri, Indiana, Tennessee, New Jersey, Delaware, and of course under United States law, federal law, it is a felony to sell paraphernalia. So that's a look at our video here on the felony marijuana amounts. And again, this will be part of the big book of marijuana facts that I'm putting out, and I'm targeting July 1st for having it done, but I'd actually like to have some pre-production copies ready for the High Times Medical Cannabis Cup. We will be there at the High Times Medical Cannabis Cup on June 24th through 26th. I think those are the dates. Am I got those right, John? 24th through 26th?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it might be 25th and 26th.
Something like that.
We're going to be there the 24th for pre-parties and stuff like that.
Right, we got to set up and everything. So that will be there in San Francisco, California. They got a new venue this year, and I hope to have some copies of the Big Book of Marijuana Facts ready for you. We'll get them signed and everything, and you can get your own copy. Full color pages, they'll be 11 by 17, and the design of the book is made so that we can show it at events. You know, like if you're at a at a hemp fest or something, you can show people these charts and give them an idea what's going on in marijuana law reform. So stay tuned for that coming up at a festival near you, the Big Book of Marijuana Facts. We hope to have that done very, very soon. Okay, and